Another thing about appreciating our differences is looking at some impediments to learning. What are some things that can maybe affect our learning profile? And that may be something that is genetically wired into us. For example, I'm mixed dominant. Well, so are my two kids. And that's interesting. They're wired genetically to be that way. And that will probably pass on from generation to generation. I have a lot of lefties in my family. And what we find out is that that can sometimes cause some learning disabilities. Doesn't mean that they're not bright, wonderful people, but it can cause some issues if we're not aware of. Other impediments to learning might be auditory processing issues. We find that a lot in kids that have had chronic ear infections, or there are some kids that have liquid fluid in their ears because of allergies. And so they're not hearing it crisp and clear like we would. And that can impact their language centers early on from 0 to 3 when those language development years are so critical. And that's why a lot of doctors will encourage things like ear tubes or looking at allergies to make sure that we're taking care of the fluid in the ears. Those auditory processing issues can affect all sorts of things then. Can affect how I hear my own silent voice when I read, so I have good comprehension. It may affect how I break down the sounds of letters and sounds. It may affect how I hear parts of words. It also may affect my attention, my ability to pay attention. What we know now about attention deficit is that that has a lot to do with auditory processing. So what are some other impediments to learning? There's ADD, there's dyslexia, which are both kind of a mixed wiring of eyes and ears. There may be some kids that are highly verbal and yet unable to express their thoughts in writing. Some people call that dysgraphia when it gets really bad. One thing that I found with some of my really left brain learners is that they may have started school really young and maybe started into that left brain activity of school so young that they weren't really ready for it. And so they get stuck in that try mode. If you remember the picture of the left side of the brain, try mode was there. Those learners get pushed into that left brain activity a little bit younger than they're ready for. Typically, boys develop a little bit slower than girls for that learning, those learning activities. And so what I'll find is that by about 3rd or 4th grade, when we take all of the right brain learning out of the books and out of the learning, that those kids then tend to have some issues and hit the wall. And a lot of times we see that in the handwriting. So handwriting is another area, that hand-eye coordination. We also see it in things like speech issues such as stuttering or self-expression. We might find it in a lack of reading comprehension. We might find it in the ability to remember verbal instruction. We might also find it that they are clumsy or athletically gifted and actually be a non-reader. Other impediments to learning are things like trauma, which is really as perceived by the individual. Something that you perceive as trauma may not be something that I find traumatic at all. And yet we see those in losses of life, in either changes of caregiver when we're growing up, whether that was via adoption or perhaps a main caregiver was hospitalized. Those things can all cause things to become unplugged. Another area of impediments, believe it or not, are highly gifted and talented children. Sometimes that can be an impediment for them for learning because they're so smart. Health issues that we're going to get into a little bit more detail later. Sensory integration issues. Sensory integration dysfunction is worked by a lot with occupational therapists. And what we find with those kids is you'll typically see that they're either very hypersensitive, maybe they need the tags cut out of their pants, or they need the seams in their socks turned inside out because they bother them. Or maybe they're hyposensitive. That may be the kid that runs out into the playground and is a whirling dervish and maybe hit people and not even be affected by it, but everyone else is affected. So sometimes we'll see that kids are either seeking or avoiding sensory stimulation. And then the other areas that can be impacted by learning are nutrition, if we're not getting enough nutrition, if we're not getting enough water. And then there's some things that are different, like gender differences. There's obviously differences between the boys and the girls. So that brings us to the next thing we have to look at. We have to look at how do we appreciate the differences? What are some other things that are going to make me learn a certain way that will help me help others teach me, or help me help my mate or my children understand me better? We talked a little bit about right brain versus left brain. Am I more of a right brain learner? I may be a little more artistic. I may see things from a global perspective. I may need to know why I have to understand this. And I'm going to want metaphors and examples when I learn. If I had a fourth grade student that I knew was very right brain and very visual and very kinesthetic, which means a mover, needing to touch and move to learn, I might teach them fractions by teaching them how to cook. They're getting to have their hands in the mess. They're getting to taste and touch and employ all the senses. And at the same time, they're learning something that they're going to be able to use for life. And they're learning math. And so that would be helpful to do. Left brain kids and left brain adults are going to need more information in a logical, sequential way. They may focus on little details. They may be able to listen and not need to worry about seeing it or doing hands-on. And so it's important that we understand, am I more of a left brain or am I more of a right brain kind of a learner? Someone that I found very helpful is Carla Hannaford, who has her doctorate in neuroscience and education. She did her whole doctorate on dominance profiling and looking at what was their dominant eye, ear, hand, foot, and brain, and looked at how that impacted how they best learn. Did they need to sit in one spot in the classroom? Did they need to be able to turn one ear to be able to hear? Were they a kinesthetic mover? Did they need to be able to sit in the back of the classroom so that they could move and still be able to process that information? So that is another really helpful thing to know. And that's something that I do with clients that come in and sit down with me. Another area that I like to look at is, are they an introvert or are they an extrovert? An extrovert is really not just are they cheerful at a party or are they more quiet. It's really about how we energize and refill our energy banks. We know now, based on research, is that there's actually a lot of different brain chemistry and brain activity going on between an introvert and an extrovert. An introvert will process information kind of like spaghetti. It will take a long, circuitous route in their brain, whereas an extrovert will process information in short spurts, like a little macaroni, and they're able to get the information, take it, process it, and spit it back out. In a meeting, the extrovert may seem more intelligent, and an introvert may feel kind of silly because it takes them more time to process. But in actuality, when we give them that time to internally process, they'll come out with some really valuable information. What we also know about introverts and extroverts is that they have different neurotransmitters or chemicals that get those dendrites connecting and talking in our brain. It's kind of like a lock and key system. If I use the wrong key to get into my house, I'm not going to get in. A neurotransmitter gives us the right, accurate lock so that those dendrites can actually talk and the signal can be passed. Introverts tend to use acetylcholine, where extroverts use dopamine, and if you throw in a little adrenaline, they love it. There's a lot of famous introverts and extroverts in life. Sometimes people will assume that an introvert is someone that doesn't like people, and that's not true at all. There's a lot of famous actors and comedians who really like people and are very internal introverts that need that time to re-energize, but they also like people. So that's the difference between introverts and extroverts, and that can really impact how you learn. Another thing to look at in appreciating differences is our temperaments. Sometimes we are not real sensitive about things, but some people are very highly sensitive. It doesn't mean they have sensory integration dysfunction. It doesn't mean they're overly sensitive or hypersensitive or there's any problem. It just means that they're really sensitive kinds of people. They are going to take in the sights and sounds and senses of things more than other people will. Highly sensitive people will sometimes avoid interaction because they just get on sensory overload. A good example of this is party days at schools. We all know that party days can be pretty crazy. There's sights and sounds, there's tastes, there's all sorts of things going on. My sister, who's a great educator, told me that when she has classrooms full of highly sensitive kids, she tends to put parties in a bag. And so the other classrooms might be enjoying their parties. She gives her kids a bag with the party to enjoy later, one-on-one with their family. And that's just because the kids don't really enjoy it. There's too many tastes and sensations going on for them and they need the break. And knowing that about ourselves doesn't make us weak. It makes us understand and be our own advocate to tell people how we best learn.